So we're going to be presenting the third webinar in our outcome series today. Before we get started, I just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping. Oh, and I'm not advancing the slides. There we go. Okay, so today's webinar is being recorded, and the presentation will be posted on the MCTAC site. As always, the information presented today is accurate as of today's date. We do encourage you to use the chat box to type in your questions throughout the presentation, and please chat those questions into all panelists. We've set aside some time at the end for some Q&A. And in case you are new to MCTAC, MCTAC offers resources to all mental health and substance use providers throughout New York State, and MCTAC's goal is to prepare and assist providers with the transition to managed care. So this slide shows you all of the MCTAC and CTAC partners, and this slide is showing you all of the Small Business Initiative partners. And the goal of the Small Business Initiative is to assist behavioral health providers throughout New York State with the transition to managed care who have less or no experience billing Medicaid. So we're pleased to have David Worsnick and Ashley Fuss back with us today. David is a senior consultant at CCSI, and he's been with us to share his expertise throughout the series. Ashley is a research scientist at MCTAC, and she's one of their resident data gurus. So I just want to take a minute to welcome them and thank them for being with us today. And as I said earlier, today's webinar is the third in this four-part series that we've put together for you. We're going to be focused on making sense of data and communicating findings today. And our presenters are going to be using PowerPoint, but they'll also be using Excel to demonstrate some important tools for data use. The final webinar in this series will focus on how to use data to demonstrate value, improve services, and inform practice, and empower staff. And that webinar is going to be taking place from noon to 1 p.m. on Wednesday, May 3rd. So we do hope that you register for that as well. So I just want to welcome Ashley and David again before I turn it over to Ashley, who's going to get us started. Just a quick reminder again to use the chat box throughout the presentation to type in your questions. And with that, welcome everyone, and I'm going to pass the ball over to Ashley.
Great, thank you. So hi everyone, and thank you again for joining today's webinar. I'm going to start by going over today's agenda. So today we're going to cover four main things. I'm going to kick us off by giving just a brief overview of data, what it is, what are the different types, and how can you prepare your data. And then I'm going to pass it off to David, who's going to discuss with us business intelligence, talk about some business intelligence tools, and then go over a demo and some self-service analytics. So it's time to start with this quote, which reads, "In God we trust, all others must have data." And this was a picture that I actually took that was a quote that started off one of my favorite statistics textbooks. And when I first saw it, I just really liked it, and it really resonated with me because I think it's very true, and it highlights how important data really is, and how whenever we have an argument or we are trying to make a decision, or we're presenting our case, we're often dependent on having this data to support the statements that we're making. So I just really liked it. So data, data, data. So whenever we talk about data, we often jump right into talking about how we're going to collect data, how we're going to analyze it, how we're going to report on it. But I just wanted to take a second to kind of take a step back and define what it is we're actually talking about when we say data, right? So I know, at least in my experience, sometimes whether we're a researcher or we're a clinician or we're a program administrator, the way we think about data and the way that we decide what actually is data and is not data can be different. So data as a general concept refers to the fact that some existing information or knowledge is represented or coded in some form suitable for better usage or processing. Right? So data ultimately is information, and each piece of data that we have or don't have is information that we have or are missing. So data can be measured, it can be collected and reported and analyzed, and we often see data in some sort of visualization, whether it's a graph or a chart or something else that's made with a different type of tool. So data is a set of values that can often be considered either qualitative, which is descriptive, So, for example, if you're asked what color shirt you're wearing and your options are pink, blue, green, and orange, and you respond with one of those, that's a qualitative answer, right, because those colors are descriptive, they describe, they can't be averaged or done math with. Or we have our quantitative variables, which are numeric, which I think are ones that we often deal with, although not always. So if you're asked what is your age and stuff like that. So that's an example of a quantitative variable. So I like this slide because I think it did a good job of capturing all the different types of data that exist, right? So data is not just numbers. It's not just whatever is in a spreadsheet. Data is everything and everywhere, whether it's as here, it could be weather data, it could be geographical, financial, etc. So what are the different types of data? So the types of data typically are there's two main types. It could be structured data or unstructured data. So structured data is organized, it has fixed fields, it's searchable, it can be sorted, right? So an example of that is an Excel spreadsheet. If you have an Excel spreadsheet, you can do Control-F, you can sort your columns, you have all your information in a cell, it's structured. The opposite of that is unstructured data, which is often unorganized, it's messy, a lot of times it's text-based, and different examples of those include emails, Word documents, notes or memos, social media posts, etc. So in my work, I spend a lot of time analyzing data and taking raw data, which is often messy, and turning it into reports. So though it sounds pretty straightforward, the reality is that you often have to take something that is very messy. So for example, maybe you get a stack of PDFs that are handwritten, and you're expected to turn that into a report. And the other point that I wanted to make, that I often make when working with different organizations around data, and it's just a point I think is really important, is that your report is only as good as the data that goes into it. So I had a professor in graduate school years ago who used to say, garbage in, garbage out. And that kind of always stuck with me because in some ways I think it is true. Whatever the numbers that you're using, the data that you're using is what you're using to make your report to inform your decisions. So it really is important to do a really good quality check and vet your data to make sure that what it is that you are producing is accurate and correct. So preparing your data. So I like to think about it in 4 main steps. So the first, right, is creating your data set. The second is data cleaning, which can refer to things like assessing for missing data, going to see if there are any outliers or just funky values that you know were incorrectly inputted. The third being data manipulation or recoding. So maybe you need to compute a new variable. Maybe you need to change a variable that was coded 1 and 2 to 0 and 1 and stuff like that. And then our fourth one being data analysis. So at least in my work, a lot of times when I get requests to do different data analysis projects, people often think that the really hard and challenging part, or time-consuming part even, is really doing that analysis. But at least in my experience, well, of course, sometimes the data analysis part is very complicated and does take a while. Most of the time, you will spend more of your time setting up your data than actually running your analysis. And I just want to point that out. I think it's just important. I think it's important to highlight, just because I don't know. At least I feel like sometimes I'm spending forever and ever just setting up my data set, and I'm like, oh, is there a better way? Am I doing it right? Like, is this the way? Should I be spending all this time doing it? And with all my other colleagues who kind of do similar work, I think the answer is yes. That is really normal and kind of to be expected that you will spend a lot of time prepping your data to run an analysis, which sometimes can only take 5 to 10 minutes. So with that, I'm going to pass the ball over to David, who's going to talk through business intelligence.
Thank you, Ashley, and welcome back, everybody. I'm pleased to be back for the third part in our series. I'm also excited to see so many people are continuing to join us. Obviously, these are important conversations and important issues. I'm going to do a couple things today. I'm going to talk about some concepts, business intelligence. I'm going to talk about some tools that we can use to be able to gather our data, store our data, build our analysis. And then I'm going to give you a demo. So we're starting to get into some of the exciting stuff. So let's jump right in. So I like the concept of business intelligence. I've been using this for a long time. It really, for me, helps me understand all the aspects of being able to you see the underlying piece. You need to gather your data. You need to store your data. You need to analyze your data. And you need to provide data to your users to gain insight and to make better fact-based decisions. And there are tools and processes and applications and practices. There's evidence-based decision-making. So I like to think about this whole process as part of business intelligence. And you're going to, if you haven't been hearing that phrase, you're going to begin to hear about that. I'm going to talk about that later with the BI tools, the business intelligence tools. So business intelligence. So first of all, we talk about gathering data, and that's a process and tools used to access, cleanse, integrate, and aggregate information that you need. We'll talk a little bit later about a tool called Power Query that does some of the things that Ashley was talking about. It connects to your data. It finds holes in your data. It can change variables. It can, sometimes your data is messy. It can read unstructured data. It can read data from different data sources. You have to have a tool that reaches out to your data and works with it. So if you've got a data feed from your electronic medical record and it's a little messy and you've got some duplicate services, you can use Power Query to go and clean it up. One of the things that we have to think about in providing information to people is you can't touch it every single time. We have to find tools that cleans our data up, brings it into an environment that we can work with, and pretty much does that automatically for us every time. Because you and I both know is when we have to touch it, when we have to manipulate it, when it's somebody's responsibility, then that's when our data doesn't get presented to us on a timely basis. It doesn't get presented to us on an accurate basis. So the first thing we think about in business intelligence is gathering your data. An example, writing a report from your EHI, that's gathering data. Downloading Psyche's data, that's gathering data. Using a query tool to directly access a database, that's another way that you can gather data. So that's the first step in your business intelligence process. The next step is storing your data. So, Ashley had talked about data in all different kind of data sources. Your data is living in different places. It has to be stored, it has to be available, and it has to be protected. So one of the things we're going to look at later is a tool called Power Pivot that will work with the Power Query to gather your data, to bring it into an environment that you're allowed to shape it and clean it up, and then store it in a usable format. One of the things that I do want to remind people is many times we get data from our electronic medical record, and those systems have good security in place. You certainly need to authenticate to the application. You need passwords. Sometimes there's two forms of authentications. The databases are managed in secure environment. But once you bring that data out of your data store and put it in a more open environment, you still have to protect your PHI. So as we look at these tools and thinking about how you might use them, you always have to be thinking at the same time as, am I protecting this data properly? So just a note, and because again, once you bring your data out of secure sources, you have to maintain the security of that information. But some of the examples, where does your data live? Well, it can live in your database, in your EHR. It could be a report that's sent to an Excel or a CSV file that sits on your network. So data can be stored in different places and in different formats. So that's the sort of the second step. First, you got to gather and clean your data, then you've got to store it. And then we start taking a look at the analytic process. And I will reiterate what Ashley said. I think that sometimes the analysis takes a very little time. It takes time to build your structures, particularly if you do visualizations. That takes some time. But a lot of the work in the beginning is making sure that you have good, clean data. I can't emphasize that more. If it looks like it doesn't make sense, then believe me, it probably doesn't make sense. So once we get the data in what is data analysis? Well, it's a way of looking for patterns, similarities, disparities, trends. How do we understand our data? What story is it telling us? How is it informing us about how well we're doing? That's the analytic process. The analytic process could be something very simple. I think sometimes we think it's this mysterious thing that happens in the background and, you need an understanding of statistics, but, analysis of data could be something as simple as a bar graph. You have a bar graph that examines the percentage of clients that report reduction in smoking after a smoking cessation intervention. Well, that's information. That's information we can use. That's information we can consume. I think that sometimes the concept of analysis is overblown. And we'll look at a demo a little bit later. That's a simple kind of monitoring tool that's analysis. Now, when you start diving into the data and looking a little bit further beyond just the visualization and trying to gain insight, that's a little bit different process. But from the front end, looking at your data, making sense, having it tell your story so it's actionable. That is part of your analysis. And the third part is providing data to your end users. And it's the process and tools used to provide data to end users. We've talked about this before. You have to really create a structure where that process almost becomes automatic. You have tools to clean your data up. You have tools to bring it into your environment. You build your visualizations, and you provide information to people. What you're looking at, an example on the screen, is something we're going to develop in a little while. Yeah. This, again, is an example of a data visualization for analysis. So we've been following our outcome metric of initial evaluations performed within 10 days of initial contact with an agency goal of 100%. Well, this is an example of a dashboard that could be built against your data. It gives you an idea by month of how many intakes you had, how many of those met your goal. You have a little conditional formatting, so up in the left-hand corner, you can look at that real quickly. You can see if it's red, it's bad. If it's yellow, it's moving where you need it to be. If it's green, it's good. Simple stuff. In this case, we use slicers, so you can take a look at your performance by your program categories. You can take a look at your performance by your payers. You have an account of your average days, and you have your trend analysis. And in this case, these folks did really well in the beginning, but something happened. So you use this data as part of your monitoring of your outcomes, part of your quality improvement process. So if you look down at the graph in the bottom, these folks stood this process up really well. They got through August, they were 100%, and suddenly the floor fell out. So then use your data. Why did that happen? What happened in this case? And if you've got this data and you're monitoring it on an ongoing basis, then the first month in September when you see a dip, it was 100% for 3 consecutive months, then it went down to 90. That's when you start asking your questions. What happened? And the fourth in this series, we're really going to take a much deeper dive into thinking about how we utilize this data, how we use it to monitor our programs, empower our staff, assure that we're meeting our metrics. So this is sort of a review of that business intelligence process. It's sort of like the onion, where at the core you gather your data, then you put your data, your clean data, into some kind of usable data store. You build your visualizations from there, and then you use that data to gain your insights and make decisions. I do also want to talk about a concept called self-service analytics. I'm sure I've mentioned this before. It's really an approach to data delivery and analytics that enable end users. So they have little or no background in data analysis to access and use your data for decision making. I kind of think of this kind of a display as self-service analytics. You can stand this up in your environment. This is just an Excel spreadsheet, by the way. And I can go to it, and I don't need to know anything about Power Query or Power Pivot or pivot tables or how this is created. All I need to do is know how to click on the slicers which filter my data, which automatically changes my displays. And at this point, then I can begin looking at how we're doing on this metric without any real training. So the idea is that your presentation and your data has to be clear and it has to be intuitive. It has to fundamentally address the questions and concerns that you have. So, that's part of the process of really that we've talked about before, is understanding your outcomes, breaking them down into their component parts, and then putting together an environment that will allow you to, that will really support your end users without a great deal of training. Because, you can build beautiful systems, and if people don't understand it, if you have to complicated training for them to figure it out and use it, it's just not going to get used in the way that you want it to be. So let's talk about tools. Let's talk about the exciting stuff. So Microsoft has a suite of business intelligence tools, and the reason that I talk about this is because these tools, believe it or not, are sitting on probably almost every one of your desktops. They are baked into Excel. And what's frustrating for me is that I go around and we talk with people, and and they're looking at Tableaus and Tableau servers, and they don't really understand how they're going to, and I talk about data analytics and visualizations, and everybody goes, yeah, that's great, but we can't afford to hire consultants. I can't buy expensive software and applications, and we really don't know how to do this. Well, believe me, you have tools, and everything that I've been showing, and if you've been joining me for the Excel training, everything that I've been showing is right in Excel. You have the analytic capacity and the visualization capacity sitting on your desktop right now. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, because it's not as hard as you think it might be. So let's talk about the tools. Power Query, Power Pivot, if I was in Microsoft, I probably would have changed the name a little bit, but they use Power to describe all of their business intelligence tools. So what's Power Query? I mentioned it before. It's a tool for gathering data into Excel. It connects to multiple data sources. And what you can do is you can use it to combine your data. We're going to show you that a little bit. Transform your data. We're going to show you a little bit of that. And shape your information. So as Ashley was saying, I mentioned your data is sometimes a little ugly. But Power Query can connect to your data source. It can transform your data, and it can put it into a usable format. Critical. It's just an absolute critical aspect of business intelligence and getting your outcome metrics out to your users who need them. The second piece we're going to talk about is Power Pivot. Power Pivot's an add-on in Excel. It enables you to load large amounts of information into Excel. You can also create relationships in there. You can make calculated fields and measures to be used for your analysis. I'm going to show you a little bit of this. Power Query is a little bit easier than Power Pivot. Power Pivot starts getting down into the weeds a bit, needs a little bit more training. The Power Pivot is really a data modeling tool. It allows you to take information from different sources, different places, bring them together into a single model that you can use for analysis. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Power View, I'm going to go through these real quick. Power View is a sort of visualization tool that lives inside of Excel. Also, in the Power BI desktop is a much richer and robust tool for creating interactive charts and graphs, but that's a little outside of the scope of what we can do today. So, in about 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to try to show you some of these tools. This is a demonstration. It's not designed to teach you any of these skills. It is designed, though, to introduce you to some of the tools that you have sitting on your desktop today. So it's a demonstration. So we're going to go back to our outcome measure. Our outcome measure we had talked about is the percentage of new consumers with an initial evaluation provided within 10 business days of first contact. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to hop over to Excel, and you should be seeing a blank spreadsheet. So I'm being a little brave, and we're going to build this right inside of a blank spreadsheet to show you the tools. So let's talk about our data a little bit. So here's a different Excel spreadsheet. So this is an example. This is a sample database that I've been using in the Excel training, and it's data that is representative of data that you might be able to get out of a report, out of your electronic medical record. It's basically billing data. It gives you the staff, the program, the date, start times, end times, what service was provided, units, CPT codes, who the client was, the payer, payer type, basic information, basic billing data. And remember, we're trying to isolate the time between an initial call and an initial evaluation. Well, our initial evaluation data is in this data. So here's the initial assessment. So I have a record of all my initial assessment that's coming out of my electronic medical record. What I can't get out of my electronic medical record is at least not in the format that I needed, is the date of an initial call. So in this example, in creating sort of thinking through what this environment may look like, we have different data for that. And the data that we have for this is a client identification number and the date that they first called for an initial assessment. So let's think about this for a second. So I've got the data that I need about when the initial assessment was completed. I have the data that I need to determine when they first called. So the task that we're going to have right now is how do I connect to that data? How do I join that data? And then how do I build a simple analytic and visualization environment? So let's close this guy down. I don't want to save that. Let's go to a blank spreadsheet. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Power Query tool. What you're looking at right now is Excel 2016. Just a side note, if you're going to start moving down this path, you will need probably at least Excel 2010. Certainly 2013 will work nice. My recommendation would be is if you can go to 2016. Microsoft has been putting a lot of changes into this environment, and it's really, I found it to be the best version for doing your data analytics. Again, this is just a demo, so I'm going to probably be moving fairly quickly. I'm going to lose some people, but I think it's important for you to see what opportunities that you have right now. So I'm going to go and I'm going to build a new query. And I'm going to tell it I want it from a file. And in this case, I want it from a workbook. There are a number of different, you can see all the different databases that you can bring data in from. You can do it from Microsoft Azure. You can do from online services, from other sources. Ashley had talked about where that data comes from all different places. Well, your query tool allows you to connect to data that lives in many different environments, many different formats. It's a pretty robust tool for connecting to your data. But in this case, I'm going to keep it simple, and I'm going to connect to my, I'm going to connect to my data, which is right now just in an Excel file. So this is the data that I showed you before. We've got a connection going on here, and you'll see it connects to my data, and I have two data tables in there. One is for my billing data, and the other is for my call log data. So let's start with my call log data first. So I'm going to connect it. This looks very much like we just looked at inside of Excel. I don't have to do much to this data. It's pretty clean. I'm going to go to Edit here. And you'll see that the whole set of tools related to data query, where you can transform your data, you can add columns, you can clean things up, you can remove rows, you can choose columns, you can merge query, you can do all kinds of things. It sets up your steps here. It's pretty intuitive. The first step, it reads the source. The next step, it picks which of the tables we're going to work with. It changed one of my data fields because it probably wasn't absolutely certain it was a date, so it changed it into a date. So that's pretty straightforward. I've connected to my first data source. That's the simplest thing you'll do. Then I've got to store it. So we talked a little bit before about you have to store your data. Well, I'm going to store my data in Power Pivot. Power Pivot sits in the background. It's my data model. I'm going to store it there. So I get this selection, so I'm going to create a connection. But right now, that's all I'm going to do. So I'm going to load that guy up, and you'll see my query gets read over here. I will close that down. But you'll see I have no data because I made a connection to the data. That's all I've done so far. So right now, I've told Excel where the call log data lives and what parts of that table I want. I want the whole table. I want the client ID, and I want the date of the first call. So first step, pretty simple, pretty straightforward, pretty intuitive, actually. So then I'm going to go to get my second bit of information. In my case, it's in the same workbook. So it's data here, and then you'll see the same kind of dialog box comes on. This time, I want to take my billing data. Again, it brings your data up. I'm going to go down and edit it. Let's talk about some of the simple tools that we can use for cleaning up our data. So here we have start time. Well, this is a time format, but it's pretty ugly looking. So I'm going to do something as simple as change the type to a time type. See that? Made that really pretty clear. I'm going to do the same thing over here because I want it to look good. And then I'm only interested in those initial evaluations, because that's what I'm trying to analyze. So I'm going to filter my data. I'm going to do a drop down here. You know, if you've done tables, you see this is just like working in any other table, but as you work in your table, as you shape your data, Power Query builds the statements. It builds an SQL statement that shapes your data. It saves it for you, and so then next time you just point this query to your data and it cleans it up for you. So let's take this. We're going to unselect everybody, and we're going to take only our initial assessment data, and let's see what else we have in here. So we have CPT and units and clients. So that's pretty good for right now. I could take some of these columns out, but if you're not using with big data, sometimes I leave the columns in because you may want to do your analysis by payer. Or you might want to do an analysis by staff or by program. So it's not a huge overhead of leaving that data in your system, so I'm going to leave that in my system. What I'm going to do this time is I'm going to do my load. I'm going to create a connection, but this time I'm going to send it to my Power Pivot or my data store, and I'm going to load that up. So you'll see I've created another query over here, pretty straightforward. And again, I've got no data so far in my Excel spreadsheet as you're normally used to seeing. Let's jump over to my data model over here. And suddenly, you can see my data. And you can work within your data model the same way you work with data tables, but something interesting. We knew that I had some 5,000 rows of data over in my original data set, but right now, because I filtered it, all I'm looking at is initial assessment. So it really allows you to shape your data and to form your data in different ways. So let's close this guy out because I've got something that I want to do inside of my data. Let's show our queries. I'm going to go into the billing query, and I'm going to edit it. And so what I have to do is that I have to join these two queries. I'm going to do this real quickly. I'm going to say every time you find a client number in the billing data, join it to the client number in the call data. You'll see down here I've matched 283. So I had 283 initial assessments, and now I have 283 of the calls, and it's joined on your client ID. So I know that this call is associated with this client. It's just associated with this assessment. So what I've just done is successfully combine data from two different data sources. I'm going to say OK. Then this jumps up here. Again, I'm going to move through some of this stuff pretty quickly. I don't need the ID. I already have the ID, so let's just use the call date. So now, let's look what I've got. I know the date of the initial assessment on this client, and I also know when the first call was. So now I have the data that I can begin working with. So let's do this. Let's add a column, and let's say, okay, calculate for me the number of days between the assessment and the first call. That is an absolutely simple process. I'm going to take the date, and I'm going to subtract it, and I'm going to subtract it from the call date. Oops, that didn't work. I didn't get my minus sign in there. Let's get my minus sign in there. Let's do a call date. And then let's say OK. That's going to create a new field right here. You see 1. I want that to be a whole number. So I'm going to go back into transform. I'm going to take it, do a whole number. So now I have calculated the number of days between the first call and the assessment. And you'll see they go from 1 to 15. So now I have the data that I need to begin my analysis. So let's go back to home. Let's load this back up into our data model. And then let's jump over into our data model to see what that got us. It got us our same data, but it also got us this custom field that has the data that we need. Okay, now I'm going to get a little complicated on you, because I'm going to show you a couple things of how you can use Power Pivot to really create some pretty exciting ways of looking at your data. So the first thing, we talked about in the other about numerators and denominators. You need to know how many people were in your eligible population, how many people met your metrics, and what percentage of those folks met your metric expectation, which was less than 10 days. So there's a simple way of doing that. So I'm going to write a formula up here in the top. These are called DAX formulas. If you're interested in this, there is a lot out there. So I'm just going to count rows. And I'm going to count rows, and I have to count row on my billing table, and close my parentheses. So if we look down here in the bottom, what did I do is I generated a measure that told me that I have 283 intakes. So let's figure out how many of those met my metric. It's a little bit more complicated. So let's call this percentage met. Oops, I did that wrong. Percentage met. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to write something called a calculate. I'm going to use this expression, but what I can do here is I can filter it. So I can say count those rows in the field that I developed that has the number of days, and only return the number that is less than 10. So let's look down here in the bottom. I had 283 intakes. 243 of them were less than 10 days. So I have my numerator. I have my denominator. Let's calculate my, I named this incorrectly. That's not the percentage met. This is the percentage met. So let's call this metric met. And all that is a simple formula that takes the numbers that met, divide them by the number of intakes that we had, and you'll see that we're in compliance with our metric 85% of the time. The final thing I want to do is really simple. I'm going to do an average. I'm going to do that as equal average. I'm going to pick my custom field, close my parentheses. So the average number of days now is 4.2. So as you see inside my Power Pivot, I created my numerator, I created my denominator, I created my percentage met, and I presented an average. So we're going to run over to Power Pivot real quick. I'm going to make a pivot table, and in that, let's close this guy down. So in that pivot table, I'm going to take the measures that I created. This is the number of intakes, 283. This is the number that were within 10 days. This is my metric met. I'm going to go change that into a percentage. Number format is going to be percentage. I'm going to say OK. Then I'm going to go down in here, and I'm going to add the average to that. I'm going to change that number format to and make it into a whole number. So suddenly what I have is for the entire population, I know what my, let's move this. I got this into the wrong spot. We're going to move it right here. So the other thing is, though, that's good, but it doesn't tell us any trend, what we're doing, how well we're doing on that. So I'm going to go up in here and I'm going to grab a date. I'm going to bring it into that row. And I'm going to take out the quarter. Oops, I'm going to take out the quarter. I'm going to take out the date. I'm going to open these guys up. And guess what? Suddenly I have an analysis of the number of intakes by month, the number that we met, the percentage, the metric met by month, and the average number of days that it took me each month. So let's do something like, let's build a conditional format into that. Let's go up, do something real quick because we're going to be running out of time here. So I'll show you one last thing. So we're going to go to an icon set. We're going to make this icon, oops, that's not where I want it. We're going to make this icon set right here. We're going to tell it to apply it to all of these. And suddenly you have a visual metric of how well you are doing in each of their additional months. Now, what I didn't have time to show you is what else you can do with that. So this is what we just built right now. You can build a chart then that shows you your trend line, your trend over time, as I pointed out before. You can do your slicers, so you can change the view based upon your programs, and you can then also look at it by payer. And, you know, how are you doing well against your payers? And here you can find that for this payer, we were 100%, and for this payer, we were only 85, and with different average number of days. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we'll go back to the PowerPoint. I just did want to have an opportunity to show you once again that you have tools sitting on your desktop in the business intelligence tools inside of Excel that will allow you to gather your data, clean your data, store your data, analyze your data, and build your visualizations. And you can do that with an investment in time and training, but without an investment in application and consultants and support. So with that, in case I've happily left myself 10 minutes and for Ashley and I to answer questions. I did want to remind you that we'll be doing the fourth part of the series in a couple of weeks, and we're really going to say, okay, now you got it. You figured it out. You got your data. You've built your visualization. Now what? What are the next steps? What do you do to it? How do you empower your staff? How do you analyze? How do you drill into it? And how do you really bring it forward in something that would be helpful for you? So in that case, we're going to turn it back to Daniela to see if we have any questions.
So we already have some questions, and hopefully we'll get to all of them. And if anybody has any other questions, feel free to type them in. The first question is for you, David. So it's, how can someone who is interested learn this? I've set up an Access database and understand queries, joins, etc., but I don't know if I could self-teach. Do you know of any resources, and how did you learn?
That's a good question. So I learned through a couple different processes. There are a couple of really pretty decent books out there, and what I can do is, after this, Danielle, we can maybe find a spot that I can make some recommendations for some of the materials that I've used that I found to be very helpful. There is also there's a website called Power Pivot Pro that there's a self-taught, self-paced learning module in there that I use that I found to be very helpful. There are also a number of online training, excuse me for a second, that was my timer. Online trainings that you can purchase. They're normally, you can do that at your own pace, on your own time. What I'll do is we'll put together some resources and we'll make a list. I was remiss in not doing that. I assume that this.
Yeah, and then there's also the MCTAC Consultant Directory on the MCTAC website that folks can use if they want to look through there and see if there's any consultants that fit your needs.
Okay.
So the next question is, I did get an estimate from a company to do this work for us, and it was very high. I do know of consultants that would set this up, so that, I think we already answered that question.
Yeah.
Unless you have.
Yeah, and the point that I want to make is that the simple stuff that I showed you today really doesn't involve more than intermediate Excel skills, to be perfectly honest with you. Some of the training packages out there, they give you databases, they walk you through it. I went through it fast. It looks complicated, but you know, I think it's something that folks should give a run at. I do want to plug in the presentation tomorrow that we're doing, I believe, from 2 to 3, which is the third-part series in the Excel. I'm going to go over these tools. We'll go over them again. Have more time. We'll go through them more slowly. If you haven't registered for that and you're interested, you can pop out and register for that and get a second dose of this if you're interested.
Okay, thank you. What versions of Excel have the visual green, yellow, red figures in the table?
I think that those are the conditional formatting. I do believe those started pretty like Excel 2010. Yeah, I think they're pretty early back and they've been carried forward. So those conditional formatting are pretty cool, and those are really pretty easy to apply. And you can control them based upon what your benchmarks are. So they're right up there on the main menu bar. It's called conditional formatting. Drop in there. You can, the way I taught myself is I Googled conditional formatting, and you will get more instructions, including YouTube instructions, than you can ever use.
Okay, we have another question. What are the pros of merging different data sources using the query that you demonstrated for us?
Sometimes it's absolutely critical. So, because as we were looking at today, I had data. I need two different pieces of data. Well, I need more than two different pieces of data, but fundamentally, I need two different pieces of data. I need data on when an assessment was done, and I needed data when the call was made. But those data were in two different places. And you're going to find that is going to happen to you all the time, because what we're seeing is that, you know, as our electronic medical records move along at a glacial rate, our need to develop our outcomes are developing. I mean, our development cycle now for outcomes is 6 months if we're lucky. So you're not going to get your data from a single source. You're always going to have data from multiple sources. So that's why I think this is such a critical tool, is that the numerators and the denominators that you need can live in two different places. So you're going to have to learn how to take those two pieces of data, merge them or join them to create a single data source that you can then run your analytics against.
Okay, I think we've gone through all the questions we've gotten so far. We have a couple of minutes left. If people want to chat in another question or two, we do have time. We could give folks another minute. Oh, yes, we do have another question. Look at that. Who's hosting the Excel series mentioned? Okay, so that's your, do you want to talk a little bit, David, about your This Is How You Do It series?
I am hosting the Excel series. It was under the CTAC, and there was a three-part series. The first part was fundamental elements in Excel tables, primarily. The second presentation 2 weeks ago was on pivot tables. And the third presentation, which is tomorrow, is on this Power Pivot and Power Query. Again, really, that's more of a this is how you do it. So as part of that series, we've actually provided people with a sample database. Each of the presentations are recorded, and we encourage people to go back and to grab the copy of the database, to watch the recording, and to practice. So if you join us tomorrow, you'll be able to grab the database. We'll be posting the call log data, and you will have the data and a recording at a much slower pace that you might be able to just try it out.
And if folks need the website, it's ctacny.org, and all of those trainings are already posted on the trainings page. You can do a search, or you can just click on the calendar, and then you'll see that presentation and all of the other presentations from this month or last month, and you just click on that link, and it'll bring you right up to the recorded webinar.
Great.
Okay, we have one more question. What is the difference between a query in Excel versus Access?
Nothing. I mean, the tools may be different. The ways that you build a query may be different. But the query is just really a set of statements that define certain actions to be taken on your data. So when it could, the Power Query probably looks different from the queries that you may build in Access, but it serves the same function. It's to go out to connect to your data and then to bring it into Access. You can bring it into Access. In Excel, you can bring it right into the Excel table. I didn't show you that. Or you can bring it into the Power Pivot to do a couple other build your measures, build your key indicators, that kind of thing. So it's a very simple process. I mean, it does the same thing. It has, maybe the tools look a little bit different. I don't do a lot of work in Access, so I can't speak to what the Access query tools look like, but you can use Power Query inside of Excel to access and to connect to an Access database also. The other piece that I do want to point out is that, as part of my responsibilities, I have financial CFO responsibilities, and I use this and do a lot of work inside of outcomes and data metrics and data analytics. But I use this tool across all the different aspects of the work that I do. It's very helpful on the finance side, and it's certainly, I think, critical tools as it relates to your outcome analysis and being able to stand up your metrics. So, if you sit next to somebody in finance and, you can go over and say, show me how you use your Power Query, and they'll say, what are you talking about? And you go, let me show you. But they are tools that can be applied across a number of different functions in your organization.
Okay, thank you, David. It doesn't look like we have any more questions, and it looks like we're just about out of time. So I just want to give a big thanks to David and Ashley again, and to all of our participants on the call or the webinar today. And hopefully we will see you all again in 2 weeks for the last webinar in the series. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.